What if I told you that a trade war intended to bring a nation to its knees could instead become the catalyst for its greatest economic transformation? How does a country outmaneuver a superpower not with confrontation, but with quiet resilience and strategic patience? The delicate equilibrium of the North American economy, a finely tuned engine of integrated supply chains and shared prosperity built over generations, was abruptly thrown into question. The tremor originated not from a market crash or a natural disaster, but from a shift in political philosophy emanating from the Oval Office. In the early days of this new era, Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump presented a cordial front, a photo opportunity meant to reassure the world that the long standing friendship between the United States and Canada remained intact. But beneath the surface of handshakes and pleasantries, a profound economic confrontation was brewing, one that would test the resilience of a nation and redefine the balance of power on the continent. The opening salvo came not from the president himself, but from his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, during a conference in Toronto. Behind the closed doors of a business forum, Lutnick delivered a message that was as blunt as it was unnerving. He reportedly told the assembled audience of Canadian business leaders that when it came to the crucial auto sector, Washington's policy was now brutally simple: America first, Canada second. This was not a subtle diplomatic hint, it was an open threat. The message from Washington, as Lutnick made clear, was an ultimatum: move production south of the border or prepare to face the consequences. In Ontario, the industrial heartland of Canada and the epicenter of its auto industry, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Premier Doug Ford, recognizing the gravity of the statement, decried it as a massive threat, noting that such a directive could only come with the explicit approval of the president. For countless Canadians, this was the moment the abstract tensions of trade negotiations became deeply personal. It was a direct challenge to the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of workers and a fundamental assault on the principle of partnership that had long defined the cross-border relationship. The expectation in Washington was clear: a smaller economic power faced with the full weight of American leverage would have no choice but to capitulate. What came next, however, was not surrender. It was strategy. Instead of reacting with reciprocal anger, Ottawa chose precision, embarking on a multifaceted campaign of economic reinforcement, quiet diplomacy, and strategic diversification that Washington had not anticipated. The central flaw in the American strategy was a fundamental misunderstanding of the very system it sought to dominate. The White House aimed to pull the strings of North American manufacturing, viewing it as a zero-sum game where jobs could be forcibly repatriated. Yet its chosen weapon tariffs began to choke the same intricate supply chains upon which American automakers were profoundly dependent. The result was an economic irony that no one in the Oval Office could afford to ignore. A car assembled in an Ontario plant, for instance, typically contained more than 50% of its parts sourced directly from the United States, according to figures from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. This was not a one-way street. The United States, in turn, sells more of its finished vehicles to Canada than to any other single country in the world. Every sedan rolling off an assembly line in Michigan and every truck built in Ohio was part of a vast, interconnected network that stretched seamlessly across the Great Lakes, a shared industrial base that had taken more than half a century to construct. This deep integration meant that tariffs were not a surgical tool, but a blunt instrument that inflicted damage on both sides of the border. A report released in the summer by the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association starkly illustrated this reality, projecting that American automakers were on track to pay an astonishing 188 billion US dollars in additional tariff costs between the years 2025 and 2028. These were not taxes on foreign competitors. They were taxes paid by American companies on parts imported from their own suppliers in Canada. The administration had promised a flood of new jobs returning home. Instead, costs for manufacturers and consumers began to climb, and an economic slowdown began to ripple across the very industrial states the policy was designed to protect. The Wharton budget model later provided a sobering long-term forecast estimating that persistent tariffs could trim up to 0.6% of U.S. GDP while reducing average American wages by about 0.5%. In its attempt to redraw the borders of production, Washington had forgotten just how integrated North America had already become. You cannot violently separate what has been built together for generations without risking the collapse of the system itself. While the White House celebrated its tariff-driven offensive, Ottawa was quietly reshaping the rules of its own market. Canada strategically maintained a 25% counter tariff on American-made vehicles, a measure of proportional response. Crucially, however, it coupled this with a remission framework, a sophisticated policy tool that offered incentives for companies willing to maintain their production and employment levels within Canada. It was a subtle but powerful form of pressure. Stay and receive support, or leave and lose access. To further buttress its industries against the shock, the federal government launched a $2 billion Canadian Strategic Response Fund designed to help manufacturers and their workers absorb the immediate disruption. The goal was not retaliation for its own sake, but reconstruction, a deliberate effort to turn a temporary crisis into a pathway toward greater long-term economic independence. Simultaneously, Ottawa and the Ontario government kept diplomatic channels wide open. Representatives like David Patterson engaged in relentless direct talks in Washington, meeting with governors, senators, and members of Congress on a weekly basis. Their message was consistent and grounded in economic reality. Canada buys more American-made cars than any other market in the world, and severing those ties would mean American industry losing its largest and most reliable customer. Back home, the focus shifted from defense to offense. The government began to prioritize the domestic production of electric vehicle batteries, investing heavily in the processing of critical minerals like nickel and lithium. Automakers were encouraged to source more of their components locally. By strategically linking the future of the auto sector to the development of its vast critical mineral resources, Canada transformed a moment of profound weakness into a coherent and forward-looking industrial strategy. The response from major manufacturers was telling. Instead of fleeing, they doubled down. Volkswagen and Stellantis proceeded with their large-scale battery plant projects, their decisions bolstered by provincial and federal incentives. Both Japanese and American automakers reaffirmed that Canada's stable workforce, reliable energy supply, and continued access to global markets made it a safer, more predictable long-term base than an America caught in a cycle of trade volatility. For Washington, the outcome was entirely unexpected. The policy designed to bring jobs back to the United States had instead strengthened and modernized Canada's manufacturing ecosystem, leaving it more self-reliant than before. The trade war, however, was not confined to the auto sector. The Trump administration soon expanded its protectionist measures, imposing heavy duties on other pillars of the Canadian economy. Steel and aluminum, vital to manufacturing on both sides of the border, were targeted. The lumber industry, a cornerstone of British Columbia's economy, was hit with staggering tariffs, with some producers facing duties as high as 45% on their shipments to the United States. This escalation moved the conflict from the factory floor to the construction site and into the homes of ordinary Americans. The impact was immediate and quantifiable. Official U.S. data revealed that the average price of Canadian lumber entering the American market was now nearly 50% higher than it had been just a year prior. For a nation grappling with housing affordability, the consequences were severe. Industry estimates suggested that this price spike was adding between $9,000 and $10,000 to the cost of a single new American home. In states already struggling with housing shortages and the immense cost of wildfire recovery, the spike was devastating. Canadian producers were suffering in parallel. Companies that had once shipped as much as 90% of their output south were forced to cut staff and idle production lines. Many reported paying hundreds of millions of dollars in duties since the year 2017, a crippling financial burden that compelled them to reduce their workforces by more than half simply to remain solvent. The fallout was particularly severe across the resource-dependent communities of northern British Columbia, where smaller secondary manufacturers, unable to absorb the costs, began to disappear altogether. In both countries, the tariff war had ceased to be a political slogan. It had become an expensive and painful reminder that walls in trade rarely stand on only one side. It was against this backdrop of escalating tensions and growing economic pain that Prime Minister Mark Carney prepared for his second high-stakes visit to the White House. The atmosphere was vastly different from his first cordial meeting with President Trump. 5 months had passed, and the landscape was now littered with tariffs and counter-tariffs. In Washington, the political climate was just as fraught, with parts of the federal government shut down following a bitter budget stalemate. Carney's trip was no longer a diplomatic courtesy. It was a stress test of the president's entire economic agenda. The Canadian team had worked for weeks to reopen discussions on metals and forestry, but their goals were modest and pragmatic. The aim was not the complete removal of all duties, an unrealistic expectation given the political climate, but to reach a point where trade could resume under more predictable, stable rules. The Canadian strategy was a test of endurance rather than a direct confrontation. Ottawa's leadership understood a fundamental truth. The two economies were far too intertwined for one to hurt the other without feeling the blow itself. The United States was Canada's top customer for metals and forest products, while Canada provided nearly 1/5 of America's imported construction materials. Every new tariff ricocheted through that shared supply chain. Canada's approach was to stick to a deliberate and patient strategy. The government maintained its credit ratings, provided targeted support to its most vulnerable industries, and pointedly avoided any retaliatory measures that could worsen the standoff. The calculation was that over time, American industries themselves would begin to feel the pressure from rising costs and supply chain disruptions. That pressure was now becoming visible. Governors from key industrial states like Michigan and Pennsylvania had begun to publicly voice their concerns over layoffs and disruptions. Business groups that had once championed the president's tough trade stance were now pleading for predictability instead of punishment. As Carney stepped into the Oval Office again, the tariffs intended to make Canada yield were, ironically, exposing the weaknesses of America's own economy. If he could secure even a partial agreement, a minor adjustment to stabilize duties on steel and aluminum, it would be a quiet but significant victory. It would signal that the costs of the trade war had become too high for Washington to ignore and prove that in this economic battle, patience could be a more powerful weapon than pressure. It would show that a smaller nation, through restraint and resolve, could withstand economic coercion, and that endurance can sometimes be the most effective negotiation tool of all. As the trade conflict with the United States intensified, a parallel strategy was unfolding within the Canadian government. one aimed not at weathering the storm, but at sailing beyond it. Recognizing the profound risks of its over reliance on a single trading partner, Ottawa began an ambitious and systematic pivot toward global diversification. Prime Minister Carney, facing criticism at home that his international trips were yielding few concrete results, used a press conference in London to forcefully articulate this new direction. When a reporter challenged him, suggesting he was jetting around but getting nothing done, Carney didn't deflect. Instead, he turned the question into a showcase of a cohesive global strategy. He pointed to a new web of trade relationships being built around the globe, deliberately positioning Canada as an open, stable, and reliable destination for capital and commerce at the very moment its southern neighbor was erecting new barriers. The cornerstone of this European outreach was the EU Strategic Partnership for the Future, signed in June. This was not a standard trade agreement, but a deeper framework designed to enhance mutual economic security. It was explicitly linked to Europe's new SAFE initiative and the REARM Europe plan, both of which involved the mobilization of hundreds of billions of euros for infrastructure and defense spending, opening up vast new opportunities for Canadian firms. This proactive engagement stood in stark contrast to the uncertainty plaguing North American trade. The pivot extended far beyond Europe. In Asia, Canada signed its first ever bilateral trade agreement with a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. The deal with Indonesia, a dynamic and rapidly growing nation of more than 270 million people, was a landmark achievement. It was set to reduce or eliminate tariffs on 95% of Canadian exports into an economy projected by the International Monetary Fund to become the fifth largest in the world within 2 decades. Each of these agreements was a deliberate step away from dependence on the American market, a practical consequence of Washington's protectionist turn. The tariffs designed to pressure and isolate Ottawa were, in practice, accelerating Canada's pivot toward Asia and Europe. To make this global outreach credible, the government knew it had to make Canada a more attractive destination for investment. Ottawa launched a series of bold domestic reforms designed to signal that Canada was open for business. In its first 4 months, the government cut personal income taxes for more than 22 million Canadians and reduced the capital gains tax. It took on the long-standing problem of internal trade barriers, passing legislation to remove federal obstacles to interprovincial commerce to create what Carney termed one Canadian economy. Crucially, it passed legislation to fast-track the approval processes for major projects in strategic sectors, including energy, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and trade infrastructure. These policies were coupled with direct outreach to some of the world's largest infrastructure funds in London and New York. Carney's message to them was simple and compelling. Canada is building a modern, stable economy and needs hundreds of billions of dollars in investment over the next decade. While President Trump pursued tariffs that unsettled markets, Canada was offering stability, predictability, and a clear path to growth. For international investors, the signal was unambiguous. Global capital was not only welcome, but would be safeguarded. The most immediate and powerful element of this diversification strategy, however, lay closer to home. The Trump administration's high-pressure tactics had inadvertently created common ground between its two North American partners. Recognizing this, Prime Minister Carney moved swiftly to deepen Canada's ties with Mexico. Just days before the American ambassador in Halifax dismissed Canada's defensive posture as anti-American, Carney was in Mexico City meeting with President Claudia Sheinbaum. The two leaders signed a comprehensive bilateral agreement on trade and investment and launched a new Canada-Mexico action plan. This was far more than a symbolic gesture. It was the first concrete step in repositioning Canada within the North American supply chain ahead of the mandatory review of the USMCA, or CUSMA, as it's known in Canada, scheduled for the year 2026. By linking arms with Mexico, Canada demonstrated that it could look beyond Washington for partnership and stability. Mexico offered a growing market for Canadian agriculture, energy, and manufacturing inputs. For Canadian canola farmers who had struggled with tariffs and lost access to the Chinese market, Mexico's burgeoning biofuel sector represented a vital new opportunity. The agreement also included cooperation on crucial infrastructure, such as ports, rail lines, and energy corridors, addressing a long standing Canadian weakness in moving its resources to market efficiently. More importantly, the partnership sent an unmistakable message to Washington. Ottawa was not negotiating alone. As both countries began their public consultations ahead of the 2026 Trade Pact review, this renewed alliance provided a crucial layer of insurance against the unpredictability of American policy. The very tariffs that Trump had used as a wedge to try and split Ottawa and Mexico City had now created a foundation for a united front. The irony was palpable. The attempt to corner Canada was instead motivating the creation of new continental bonds that Washington had never anticipated. As the trade dispute wore on, it became increasingly clear that Washington's strategy of economic coercion was failing to achieve its intended effect. Instead of intimidating Canadians into submission, it was fostering a powerful sense of national unity and resolve. This shift was perhaps best captured in the public reaction to comments made by the American ambassador, Pete Hoekstrom. Speaking in Halifax, he dismissed Ottawa's Elbows Up campaign, a public awareness initiative encouraging Canadians to support domestic industries, as anti-American. His criticism was meant as a stern warning, a signal of Washington's growing frustration. Yet, for many Canadians, the comment was interpreted as definitive proof that their pushback was being felt. Far from backing down, people across the country felt encouraged to stand taller, to consciously buy Canadian goods, and to view the dispute not as a crisis to be feared, but as a chance to demonstrate collective resilience. What was framed as an insult ended up reinforcing the national confidence that Canada's defensive stance was both necessary and effective. This burgeoning sense of pride was fueled by the clear evidence that the American tariff strategy was built on a flawed premise. In March of 2025, the White House had imposed a 25% duty on imported cars and auto parts, followed in July by a 50% tariff on copper. Steel and aluminum remained under heavy duties. The Department of Commerce itself confirmed that these sectoral tariffs were part of a broader strategy intended to expand beyond metals. This created a climate not of compliance, but of crippling uncertainty. Business leaders in both countries pointed to the same reality: long-term investment stalls, when the rules of trade can be rewritten at a president's discretion. For Canadians, the lesson was stark. The attempt to weaken their resolve had instead driven consumers to support their own, reinforced a culture of resilience, and made painfully clear that reliance on American goodwill was a risk too great to ignore. The ultimate failure of American pressure was its inability to isolate Canada. The more the Trump administration leaned on tariffs, the more Canada looked outward and discovered new sources of strength. The confrontation meant to weaken the country had only strengthened its resolve. The final picture that emerged was not one of a supplicant nation begging for relief, but of a confident partner reminding its powerful neighbor of a fundamental truth. In a deeply interconnected global economy, real strength comes not from disruption and coercion, but from cooperation, consistency, and credibility. The trade war that began as a test of loyalty had transformed into a test of endurance, and Canada had quietly outlasted the aggression. Prime Minister Carney, in his subsequent meetings in the Oval Office, would arrive not as a supplicant, but as the leader of a nation that had been tested and had emerged more resilient. He came as a partner, prepared to remind the United States that shared prosperity, not rivalry, is the only sustainable foundation for true strength. For all the talk of America first, the reality laid bare by the conflict was that the United States cannot thrive without the very partners that make its own prosperity possible. The harder Washington tried to divide the continent, the clearer it became that North America only succeeds when it moves together. This may have been the greatest and most unintended lesson of the entire ordeal. Beyond the immediate economic and diplomatic victories, this period of intense pressure instigated a deeper, more permanent transformation within the Canadian economy and its national psyche. For decades, Canada had comfortably existed as a branch plant economy, a reliable and resource rich partner whose industrial strategy was often defined by the needs of its larger neighbor. The tariff crisis served as a national wake up call, forcing a countrywide conversation about economic sovereignty and the urgent need to move beyond a paradigm of dependency. This was not merely about weathering a political storm, it was about fundamentally re engineering the country's economic architecture for a more volatile and competitive 21st century. The shock of the tariffs acted as a powerful accelerator, compressing what might have been a decade of gradual economic evolution into a few frantic years of reinvention. This shift was most visible in the surge of innovation and investment in sectors where Canada held a distinct strategic advantage. The government's focus on critical minerals was no longer just about digging resources out of the ground and exporting them. It became about building the entire value chain, from mining and processing to advanced battery manufacturing and recycling. This created a closed loop ecosystem for the electric vehicle revolution, attracting the likes of Volkswagen and Stellantis, not just for assembly, but for the high value research and development that accompanies it. Similarly, the crisis spurred a new sense of urgency in Canada's burgeoning tech sector, with global supply chains suddenly appearing fragile. Canadian firms specializing in artificial intelligence, logistics, software, and advanced manufacturing found new domestic markets. Companies that had once looked south for their first major contracts began to find eager partners at home as Canadian industries sought to insulate themselves from future shocks by building shorter, smarter, and more resilient supply chains. This industrial stress test, while painful, forced Canadian businesses to become more efficient, more innovative, and ultimately more globally competitive. The legacy of this era, therefore, is not simply a collection of new trade agreements or resilient industries. It is a permanent realignment in Canada's view of itself and its place in the world. The new trade corridors being forged with Europe and Asia are not temporary detours, but foundational pillars of a new, more balanced economic policy. The relationship with the United States, while still paramount, is no longer taken for granted. It is now approached with a clear eyed understanding of the risks involved and an unwavering commitment to maintaining a diversified portfolio of global partnerships. The country that emerged from this trial by fire was not the same one that entered it. It was a nation that had been forced to look inward, rediscover its own innovative capacity, and build a more independent and sustainable economic future. The tariffs that were meant to command obedience had instead cultivated a quiet, unshakable confidence. In the end, Washington's attempt to dominate its partner did not break its will. It revealed its strength and, in doing so, reshaped the economic map of North America for generations to come.